Thank you for joining the Brown Bag Lunch and Learn. This is Andrea Wagner with Story County Planning and Development, and Marcus Anman is also here, and we're just going to talk about the permit requirements that the county has.
So one of the things that we hear a lot is, I live in the unincorporated area. Do I even need a permit? The answer is usually yes.
So I think people might be surprised by the amount of things permits are required for. So any new building over 100 square feet, or I should say 100 square feet or greater, any change to the footprint of the structure, so new rooms added, increasing the total square footage, fences, walls, if you're going to put up a sign for a home business or your commercial business, even a temporary structure, if it meets that size threshold, needs a permit. Change in use of a structure, grading, or some people just call it dirt work, needs a permit. Floodplain development, of course, needs a permit. If you've got mapped floodplain on your property, and you intend to do anything in it, any grading, dredging, filling, building, needs a permit. Addressing, so new 911 addresses, we'll also take a permit for that. I think some individuals think those are just for homes, but we do issue them for ag structures if a landowner requests one, because as we all know, accidents can happen at those locations too. So it just makes it easier for first responders to get there. And then conditional uses, talks more about that. But we see these a lot, especially for the A1 district, where we attach conditions to a permit for kind of intense uses that might cause nuisance issues, noise, dust, that kind of thing.
So some of the types of permits are change in use. So one that we see sometimes is changing a garage into an accessory dwelling unit. Home business permits are required. There's some caveats with state code with home businesses and what their intensity is. Sign permits for the actual physical structure of the signs, not the content of the signs. Any grading, if you're to dig a pond or do site prep for a new concrete pad, that's going to be set later. Floodplain with structures. So if you're building a structure in a mapped floodplain or installing a fence, that would be a structural floodplain permit. There's a lot of standards that go into that. With the non-structural floodplain permits, we're looking at doing things like stream bank stabilization or other grading work. So special events, you're going to have a large event but just one time. So RAGBRAI needs special event permits. We do some for the triathlon that takes place in Ames. Any conditional use permits. So like Andrea had mentioned, solar farms, wind farms, anything that's going to be increasing the level of traffic to an area. It allows us to still allow those uses to happen, but add additional conditions. Sometimes those conditions are putting down dust control for the gravel roadways so that the neighbors aren't getting as much dust, things like that. And then so zoning permit or building permits are most popular permit for building new homes or any other structures, including fences and walls. And depending on the type of project, sometimes you do have to have multiple different projects. So structural floodplain permit and zoning permit, as well as permits from other departments, maybe that need an access permit or a septic permit.
So we do often get questions from farmers or landowners if they need a zoning permit to build on their property through state code. There are some ag buildings that are agriculturally exempt. So no regulations adopted under our land development regulations apply to land, farmhouses, farm barns, farm outbuildings, or other buildings that are primarily adapted by reason of nature and area for use for agricultural purposes while so used. So that that agricultural exemption doesn't run with the land. The structure has to be, being used actively for ag purposes. So if you are building a new barn for livestock or a new, 10,000 square foot Morton building for your ag equipment, you don't need a permit from us, a zoning permit from us. And you can voluntarily apply to get an exemption certificate. There's no charge to do that, but again, we can't require it through state law. That is voluntary. And so there's a little bit of a gray area with what is exempt and what's not. So typically, hobby farms where there is no income generated by the activity, those are not exempt, or farms that are under 40 acres in size are not typically considered exempt. Dwellings, again, that can be a difficult one, especially if the individuals have, off-farm work, and just the farming is only one component of what they're doing. So that's a good case where you would submit an application for agricultural exemption, just so we could get more details on the size of your farm, the commodities you're growing, that kind of thing. And so an agriculturally exempt project, this is really important to note, it is not exempt from wastewater or septic permitting requirements or floodplain requirements. So if you were building your Morton building to store your combine in a mapped floodplain, you would still need to get a floodplain permit from us. It's the building wouldn't have to meet the required setbacks for the zoning district. And another thing with ag exemption, since it doesn't run with the land, if you build a structure that is just right on top of the road or right on top of the property lines, if you sell that property to someone else who is not farming, and then that building isn't being used for agricultural purposes, it's then considered legal non-conforming with our land development regulations. So we won't make you move it, but it means that you can't expand it further into that required setback area. So it does start to put some limitations on it. So if individuals can build within the setbacks, we recommend it. But as we know, those farmstead sites can start to get pretty crowded out for when you have a lot of grain bins, Morton buildings, barns, that kind of thing. And I think there was a question in the chat, Bryce. That would be a better question from the Environmental Health Department about the private wells. So the question is, are there any ag exemptions for private wells? Environmental Health does the well permitting. So unfortunately, I cannot answer that question for you.
So a couple years ago, we went from a paper permit to an all online permitting system. Now, all types of permits for planning and development and environmental health go through this online system. Online portal is there, and that is shown there. You got to make sure, if you're going to type that in, make sure you put the www at the front of that. So once you get to the landing page, you have to create an account. Once you have created an account, you can apply for various different permits. The licensing one handles home business permits. The permitting one is for the zoning permits, any structures you're going to be building, and then development projects, houses, where property research requests go, as well as larger projects like conditional use permits and subdivision requests.
So people often ask us, what do you need for the application? Individuals might not know that Story County does not have a building code. So when we ask for site plans, blueprints, which is one of the minimum requirements to submit with the permit, they don't have to be stamped by an engineer. We're not typically looking for something to be formatted a certain way. So site plans can be pretty basic. We get them hand drawn. A lot of individuals like to use Beacon, which is the example that I've put up there. We just need property owner consent or their signature. And then of course, payment. We don't review permits until they are paid for. And so one comment that we do get from folks in the unincorporated area especially if maybe they start to build without a permit, is that, well, I didn't think I needed one because it's not close to the property lines. And that's only part of what we're checking. We're also checking the use, if it's an allowed use in the zoning district. We do a joint review with environmental health, so they're going to check if you're adding a bedroom or a bathroom, and is that hooked up to the septic system, and is it sized appropriately? So the setbacks aren't the only thing that we care about. This site plan that I put on as an example, I think is great. This individual went above and beyond. Those setbacks are huge, but they still showed all of them. And again, they use Beacon, which is a public tool that the assessor uses to draw that out.
Regarding the process for a zoning permit, you would submit an application once the fees have been paid, as well as all of the required documents have been uploaded. It would then move on to staff review. It typically takes us 5 business days to complete our review. Also, environmental health for most permits does a review as well. So that's part of where that joint review happens. And then we'll take action to approve with conditions, deny, return to the applicant, or some other action. A lot of times our approval with conditions has conditions about septic location and making sure that that area is cordoned off so that any construction vehicles aren't damaging the septic system or its laterals, especially when we're talking about things like additions to houses. Once that happens, once our review is done, the permit would be issued and a foundation location inspection can be requested. So that is required to happen, and we need 24-hour notice prior to that requested time for the inspection. If you're doing a post hole structure, we're usually there when they're digging the holes. If you're doing a more traditional foundation, we're there usually as they've dug the hole or setting the forms and getting ready to pour. If you do not schedule the inspection and permanently install the foundation, regardless of what kind it is, a fine would be imposed for failing to have that inspection completed. A final permit will be issued after whatever the proposed or whatever the permitted structure is fully completed. The area around it is final grade, has been seeded, and has started to take. We would come out and do a final inspection just to make sure that nothing changed after we did our preliminary inspection.
So sometimes individuals also think that, okay, I need a permit from the county, but that's all, right? Like there is no other jurisdiction that has to review things, and it really depends. So if you are doing significant grading work, and we define that as greater than or equal to 1 acre, then you will likely need an NPDES permit from the Iowa DNR. That stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. So they are concerned about stormwater runoff and sedimentation and erosion on those large scale grading projects. So I think individuals think the DNR doesn't need to be involved if they're just, it's just their own private property. They've just got their one house, and they're going to dig a pond or something. They might think the DNR only needs to get involved if you're prepping, a 40-lot subdivision, and that's simply not the case. So that is something that we check for when you submit a grading permit with us, is if you've also reached out to the DNR, what size area are you going to grade? And we also do, like I think Marcus mentioned about the inspections, we check for erosion issues. And that comes into play a lot here with the grading work. We do have erosion control requirements that you're required to follow. So if you're doing any work in the mapped floodplain, And again, those mapped floodplains are going to be shown on Beacon. You can see if you have any mapped on your property. If you're doing any work there, whether it be grading, filling, building a detached garage, doing a fence, we do have to verify with the Iowa DNR and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers if they require any permits for that work. So the DNR has a joint application, an online application system that they've set up, so we can help folks submit their plans that way. And then both the DNR and the Corps have a chance to review it, because again, being in violation of our regulations is one thing, but being in violation of the DNR and the Army Corps is an entirely different set of standards. So just something to think about if you're doing work in the mapped floodplain. So we will not issue a local zoning, grading, floodplain permit, etc., until all necessary state and federal permits have also been obtained.
So the next part is what would happen what can you do if a permit were to be denied? So the starting point is to reach out to staff and see what the issue is. A lot of times in our denial, we'll state the issue, but it can usually help to then reach back out to staff and see if we can amend either the plan or provide suggestions on what changes need to happen in order for us to approve it. If that isn't feasible, then we'll talk to you about our amendment process and Board of Adjustment. So citizens can propose text amendments to our ordinance. So likely the reason the permit was denied was due to something, it was in conflict with the ordinance. So that's where the text amendment will come into place. And citizens are also able to appeal the director's decision before the Board of Adjustment. So text amendments to the ordinance or the appeals of the director's decision are not always successful, but that is ultimately up to the Board of Supervisors and the Board of Adjustment, respectively. The Board of Adjustment can also hear variance requests. Variances are very difficult to grant now due to precedent set by an Iowa Supreme Court ruling in 2021 that states if the property in question has already obtained a reasonable return, a variance can't be granted. So a lot of times once there's already a dwelling on the property, it's already met its reasonable return and the variance has to be denied.
So this slide just has a few examples of different types of amendments. So code of ordinances, that's going to be a text amendment where you can suggest alternative language or additions to our code. And we do get those occasionally if the amendment would allow you to do a project that was denied. Sometimes that's a route the individuals choose to take, and staff will take that application, maybe find a compromise on the language and make a recommendation to our Planning and Zoning Commission and then the Board of Supervisors on that. The C2C future land use map is a map that has all the different future land use designations for the county. So if it's an ag conservation area, if it is supposed to be rural residential, or an urban expansion area around our cities. So if you are, let's say, trying to get a rezoning, which is also a different type of amendment that isn't in balance with the future land use designation, you can try to amend our future land use map. And from there, then try to amend our zoning map as a rezoning. Because if you're wanting to do something on A1 that's not allowed, and we say, well, if it was A2 or commercial, then we could potentially issue a permit for this. Some individuals do choose to go to that route and try to rezone the property. So again, staff looks at that. Our Planning and Zoning Commission makes a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, who ultimately approves or denies the rezoning request. And then our Board of Adjustment, they're a little bit different from our Planning and Zoning Commission, and that the Board of Adjustment is quasi-judicial, so they do actually make decisions. And so the cases that they hear do not go forward to the Board of Supervisors. So if there is an appeal of the Planning and Development Director's decision, that goes to the Board of Adjustment. Variance requests, like Marcus mentioned, go to Board of Adjustment. And also those conditional use permits, so they get the final say. That board gets the final say on what conditions are placed on permits for things like mineral extraction. Trying to think of some other ones. Are churches a conditional use permit, Marcus? Yeah, so churches, campgrounds, that kind of thing, wind farms, more intensive uses, basically. So they get the final say on what the applicant has to do to keep that permit in good standing with us and not create a nuisance on the property.
So with those conditional use permits, they're new, so proposing entirely new use, which would have to go through our conceptual review process. And then the staff writes a report that's taken before the Planning and Zoning Commission, who makes a recommendation to the Board of Adjustment. The minor modification would be you already have a conditional use permit. It's in good standing and you're wanting to add to the use in some way. But the intensity is determined administratively, that it still needs to go before the Board of Adjustment so that they can weigh the request and approve, deny, add additional conditions. An insignificant modification is we have a CUP already, and the request is such a small change that we can just handle that administratively. Most times when a cellular provider is wanting to upgrade their towers, modify them in some way, add new antenna, change out, swap equipment, whether that's on the pole itself or in the cabinet on the ground. A lot of times those are insignificant modifications. And then with 911 addresses, so any new access or new structure being built can apply for a 911 address marker. We can and have done that even for new farm accesses, where it's a long distance from where anybody else really is. And so it's a safety precaution in case there was an accident. There's an easy way for first responders to find people if they need help. And then you can also apply for replacement address marker. Sometimes they can deteriorate. They've been out there for a decade longer. Sun starts to wear them down. Sometimes they get hit by vehicles or farm equipment. And street corner markers and road renamings, we handle all of that as well.
So this is a question we get often, very often, especially if individuals aren't maybe happy with the responses we're giving them, but they say, what if I don't get a permit and I just build anyway? What happens? Please do not do that. If we find out about it, it would result in code enforcement. So if you build something that is too close to the property line and you don't get a permit for us, we would require that you apply for a variance. And if it's granted, then the structure can stay where it is. If it's not granted, then you have to figure out how to move it or how to get rid of it. So it's not a good thing to do. It can lead to a lot of cost, a lot of headache, a lot of stress, depending on the project. And in some cases, not very many, we try to avoid this as much as we can, but code enforcement can lead to being issued a citation and being taken to court. And again, we try and get voluntary compliance with the regulations as much as possible, but sometimes that just doesn't work and we have to end up issuing a citation. So again, please do not just build without a permit and ask for forgiveness later, because we will still do code enforcement.
Please contact us before you build, or if you have any questions, there's all of our contact information.
And thank you for joining us. That ends our presentation. If you have any questions, you can ask them.